Karen sicced her dog on the royal guard in a rage, shouting, "Fido, Foz." The little Yorkshire terrier jumped at the boots, and everything around her froze. But what happened next would surprise even the most hardened of minds. But let's start at the beginning. The morning in London was chilly but busy. Tourists were swarming around Buckingham Palace, Japanese with cameras, lovey-dovey Italians, frozen Germans. And among all this multilingual crowd, there was Karen, not walking, not stepping, but gliding like a raft made of shouting demands and fast food. She was enormous, not just plump, but massive. Every cell of her body seemed to be filled with not meat, but irritation, resentment, and cheeseburgers with bacon. Her body resembled furniture that had been moved off schedule, creaking, rubbing, and grumbling at everything around it. She wore leggings the color of overripe blueberries, each step accompanied by a muted, straining rustle, as if she were scrubbing the air with her body. Over that, a shiny jacket with a metallic sheen that was stretched over her chest like a parachute already fully open. Every inhale was a feat, every exhale a threat. On her head was a gigantic hat with a brim, looking more like a satellite dish capable of receiving radio signals from neighboring galaxies. On her nose, leopard print glasses made her look less like a human, more like the king of beasts from the suburbs. In one hand, she held a Michael Kors handbag, heavy as a suitcase full of gold, and in the other, a phone, ready to record any violation of her personal code. Under her arm was a package of Bobby luxury dry dog food with beef and sauce, smelling so strong that even the pigeons wrinkled their noses. And below, her ever-present companion. A small Yorkshire terrier named Bobby. Scrawny, covered in bows and stress, he looked like he was about to write his memoirs, Life Under the Heel. Karen stopped in front of one of the royal guards. He was standing still, as he should. His red uniform sparkled, medals gleamed, his face was composed, focused, the British order in human form. Karen snorted. "You're not even gonna turn your head? It's a photo, a London photo." Her voice cut through the crowd like a warning siren. She moved closer, stepping over the invisible line of decency, and snarled, "Do you think you're special just because you stand here in a suit like a statue? My son works in a uniform too, at Taco Bell, so what?" The crowd turned. A few tourists took out their phones. Some laughed. Some waited in anticipation. Karen, choking on her outrage, pulled Bobby out of her bag and hissed loudly, "Fido, attack!" The little dog, not believing his ears but obeying reflex, jumped and rushed toward the guard. He barked, ran around, jumped on his polished boots as if trying to break through the armor of tradition. And just when it seemed like everything would be fine, a voice rang out. Not a voice, but a hammer strike on an anvil, "Step away from the Queen's Guard." It wasn't loud, it was thunderous. As if an ancient machine had come to life and was carrying out its protocol. The guard took a step forward. Just one. But that was enough for Bobby to yelp and dash back to his owner's feet. Karen to gasp, like someone had pulled the plug out of her emotional vacuum cleaner. Tourists to gasp. A child to drop his ice cream. In Karen's mind, the last connection with reality snapped. Her face turned red as beets, her lips tightened, her hands trembled. This was the moment of truth. The world didn't learn who she was, but she learned who she was to the world. Karen could no longer contain herself. Her heart pounded in sync with her rage, and her mind was literally tormented by questions. Why couldn't everyone around her understand that she was an important person? And who did this guard think he was to ignore her request? "Don't you know who I am?" Karen yelled out, furiously waving her phone as if it were her personal weapon for diplomatic negotiations. The crowd that had gathered around her began to pay more and more attention. Behind her, some whispered that she was the woman with the red purse, but Karen was so far gone in her fury that she didn't care. She demanded justice. "Are you just standing there like a statue? Ignoring me?" She continued, stepping up to the guard, her eyes burning with resentment. "I'll find you. Do you understand who you're talking to? I demand that you smile for the photo. No respect." Her voice grew louder and louder, drowning out the noise of the street. Tourists stopped and started filming on their phones, and some started quietly laughing, unable to hold back their amusement at her theatrical performance. Her little Yorkshire terrier, Bobby, seeing his owner's reaction, squirmed on the leash, trying to break free and protect her, but was unable to control his own emotions. He barked, jumped, and ran toward the guard, ignoring his cold, unchanging face. At that moment, Karen decided to let the dog off the leash, not realizing that it was the biggest mistake of the day. "Fido, attack!" she commanded, and the little dog immediately rushed toward the motionless guard, continuing to scramble at his boots. The guard, despite the gravity of the situation, stayed calm, not moving a muscle. His face was like stone, his eyes showing nothing but absolute indifference. But then, something truly unexpected happened. "Step away from the Queen's guard!" The guard bellowed, suddenly stepping aside and moving toward Karen. Her outrage immediately frozen, like water plunged into a freezer. She fell silent, not expecting such a response. However, instead of backing down, Karen felt her ego fueled by this encounter. And at that moment, her rage escalated beyond control. "Who do you think you're talking to?" she shrieked, drowning out the sounds around her. She didn't even notice how several men in uniform approached from behind. The guards, without any display of aggression, simply stood next to her, their arms crossed over their chests. "Ma'am, you need to calm down," one of the guards said, keeping his eyes fixed on Karen. "Please step away from the guard. Now I can't even express my opinion. I have a right." Karen continued to scream, her voice now laced with a hint of hysteria. The guards exchanged glances, then one of them, the larger one, took out his phone. "Ma'am, if you don't stop this behavior, we will have to call the police," he said in a monotone, yet firm voice. For a moment, Karen bit her tongue, her eyes darting between the guards and the soldier, then back to the guards. "You won't do that," she screeched again, in disbelief. "I just paid $500 for this tour. I'm going to complain. This is unacceptable." Meanwhile, the guard calmly stepped back, returning to his original position as if Karen were nothing more than a minor annoyance, not worth even wasting time on. Karen felt her anger turning into a full-blown storm. She stood before the guards, unable to calm down. Looking at their calm, expressionless faces, she felt as if they were deliberately taunting her, ignoring her rights and dignity. "How dare you talk to me like that?" she yelled, pointing at one of the guards. "I'm an American. I pay taxes. You owe me." The tourists around her, curiously watching the scene, began to whisper among themselves and record what was happening on their phones. To her, this was an utterly humiliating experience. How could she end up in a situation like this, with all these people looking at her like she was crazy? One of the guards, the larger man, calmly moved closer and, without changing his expression, said, "Ma'am, this is your final warning. If you don't stop your behavior, we'll have to remove you from this area." Karen, unable to stop herself, kept raising her voice, "You don't have the right to touch me. This is a violation of my rights." The guards exchanged brief glances. Karen didn't notice, but their patience was running thin. They weren't going to listen to her screaming much longer. At that moment, one of them stepped forward with determination. "We're warning you, ma'am." His voice was firm and calm, but there was a clear, unwavering tone. "You need to leave this area. Otherwise, we'll have to call the police." Karen hissed, her face turned red, and her eyes filled with fury. "This is tyranny. Are you out of your minds? I'll file a complaint." Before she could finish her sentence, she took a step toward the guards, and suddenly, two more officers moved in sync. One grasped her by the shoulder, while the other blocked her exit, as if they were deciding to end this scene. "Ma'am, we really need you to leave now." Karen screamed, trying to break free, but her soft, flustered figure was already under the control of two guards. All she had left in her hands was her phone, from which she had managed to take a few shots. Realizing she was losing her last chance to influence the situation, Karen began throwing words. "You don't have the right to touch me. I'll do everything to get you fired." The guards, unfazed by her threats, continued to act methodically and in sync, preventing her from doing anything. They carefully, but resolutely, led her away from the area, ignoring her screams and complaints. Karen could feel her strength leaving her, and the whole scene was becoming more absurd by the second. People in the crowd had already started losing interest, and her attempts to regain attention only made her behavior seem more pathetic. She tried to snap a few more times, but the guards didn't stop, already completely leading her outside the courtyard. Finally, when Karen was outside, a few tourists surrounded her, still filming her, but she could no longer believe in her victory. All that was left for her was to post her photos and hope the internet would remember her fame. Inside, a sense of failure was growing, but she didn't even realize what was happening to her. Karen stood on the sidewalk, weak and gripping her phone, trying to regain at least a piece of her lost pride. She still couldn't believe they kicked her out. Kicked out like a criminal. She, an American, with rights and freedoms that no one could take away. The tourists standing aside kept filming her, and she felt their gaze tear her heart apart. This is humiliation, she thought, as if not understanding that she had led the situation to such absurdity herself. All her attempts to appear strong, confident, and authoritative crashed against the harsh reality. She had failed to make the guards smile, or even instill the slightest fear in them. Clenching her teeth, she looked down. I won't let myself be weak, she thought determinedly. She lifted her head and took a step to the side, trying to walk with confidence, but her stride was nervous, filled with a sense of defeat. Suddenly, a man in the crowd, clearly older, with cameras in hand, stepped forward. Noticing her distressed state, he looked at her curiously and said, "Well, miss, how do you feel now?" Karen wanted to retort, but only empty threats and complaints were on her tongue. She was no longer ready for another verbal brawl. The man filmed her with a smile, then noticing how her face was turning red, added, "You don't really seem to understand how respect works, do you?" Karen was left stunned. He wasn't embarrassed, nor worried that she might start a scene. He was simply speaking, as if it were a given. And yet, it seemed like it should have been her who was the one everyone should respect. The person who was always used to being the center of attention, acting like a star. But her star was no longer on the pedestal. All that was left was a bunch of people with phones and a few photos, capturing her at the most awkward moment of her life. She couldn't escape from this shame, from these moments that would now spread across the internet, provoking laughter and condemnation. Suddenly, the thought struck her, no one was supposed to fear her. Because she wasn't that important. And even her anger, her discontent, meant nothing to those who were just doing their job. The guards, the security, the tourists. They just kept living their lives, unbothered by her existence. At that moment, Karen felt an empty void. She knew that her day would not be a success, and most likely, she would be remembered as the one who caused a scene at Buckingham Palace. Not because she was important, but because her behavior and her inability to understand others had become a symbol of what happens when people forget about respect and self-control. For a moment, Karen thought maybe it was time to change her approach to life. But she immediately dismissed the thought. No, she wouldn't change. She would still fight for her rights. The tourists moved away, and Karen was left alone. Lonely and disappointed. In the distance, the shadow of Buckingham Palace loomed, and she felt its gaze, so important to her, slip away. The scene with the guard was over, but her life went on. And she was still convinced that her rights were more important. With that feeling, Karen took a step forward, confident that she wasn't going to stop. But what she would bring in the future, that was another question. She hadn't learned her lesson.